Bueno, bienvenidos a una nueva edición del ciclo de conferencias La Actualidad del Pensamiento de Hegel. Es un ciclo organizado por el Centro de Estudios Filosóficos de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, en conjunto, cooperación con la Red Germano-Latinoamericana de Investigación y Doctorado en Filosofía, FiloRed. Esta vez nos acompaña la profesora Michela Bordignon de la Universidad Federal de do ABC, en la región del ABC Paulista, en Brasil, que nos va a hablar de la actualidad de la concepción hegeliana de la lógica. Michela Bordignon es profesora de metafísica en la Universidad Federal de ABC. Hizo sus estudios de filosofía, se doctoró en la Universidad de Padua, en Italia, y ha desarrollado proyectos de investigación en la Universidad de Warwick, ha hecho el postdoctorado en la Pontificia Universidad Católica do Rio Grande do Sul, en Porto Alegre, Brasil, y también en la Universidad Federal do Espíritu Santo en Vitoria, Brasil. El campo de sus investigaciones comprende las relaciones entre lógica formal y lógica especulativa, y entre la dialéctica de Hegel y el sistema lógico no clásico. También el debate en torno a la concepción hegeliana de la teleología, la vida y el organismo, así como también la relación entre la filosofía de Hegel y la metafísica del proceso o procesual. Ha sido vicepresidenta del Grupo de Trabajo Hegel Brasil y actualmente está colaborando en la preparación del próximo número de la revista de la Sociedad Hegel Brasilera, que estará dedicado al tema Hegel en palabras de las mujeres. Publicado el libro En los límites de la verdad, el problema de la contradicción en la lógica de Hegel en el año 2015, y numerosos artículos sobre los temas de sus investigaciones en revistas especializadas. El título de su conferencia de hoy es la interpretación de Hegel, o por parte de Hegel, de la paradoja del mentiroso, Hegel's Interpretation of the Paradox. La conferencia, la profesora Bordignon, que es italiana, la va a dictar en inglés. Se va a proyectar el texto de modo que la audiencia pueda seguirlo mejor. Y luego, al finalizar la conferencia, las preguntas se le pueden formularse en español, porque la profesora Bordignon comprende el español, pero a la hora de responder lo hará en inglés, porque le resulta más cómodo y fácil hacerlo. Y las preguntas, las respuestas en principio no las vamos a traducir al español para no prolongar excesivamente el evento, y de todas maneras después quedarán en la página del Centro de Estudios Filosóficos para que la gente las pueda escuchar nuevamente en todo caso. Así que, bueno, con ustedes a la profesora Michela Bordignon.
Gracias por la presentación, Héctor. Entonces, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Me gustaría agradecer también al profesor Giusti por la invitación a este ciclo de conferencias sobre la actualidad del pensamiento de Hegel. Gostaria de agradecer também ao Centro de Estudos Filosóficos da PUCP e da FiloRed. Agora, I think now it's better for me to start speaking English. My English is not so good, but for sure it's better than my Spanish. And I'm going to start my talk, which will be on the relation between Hegel's dialectic and priest dialectism. So, in my talk today, I will discuss my view on one of the possible actualization of Hegel's philosophy, which is the dialectist interpretation of Hegel's dialectical logic. Dialectism is the thesis that some contradictions are true. The most important contemporary advocate of this thesis is Graham Priest. In what is known as the Manifesto of Dialectism, his book In Contradiction, he states that, and I quote, "It is the main claim of this book that Hegel was right. Our concepts, or some of them anyway, are inconsistent." So we can ask, is Hegel a dialectist? In this talk, my aim is to show that according to Hegel, dialectism is correct in the sense of richtig, but it is not true. That is to say, it is not wahr. I will approach the problem of Hegel's relation to dialectism, focusing on a very specific topic, which is his interpretation of the liar paradox. This is relevant because, first, the consideration of Hegel's interpretation of the liar paradox shed light on his claim that contradictio est regula veri, contradiction is the rule of truth. And second, the comparison between Hegel's interpretation of the liar paradox and Priest's is a good way to make explicit the specificities of Hegel's conception of logic. So I start with a brief definition of paradoxes and of the liar paradox. We can begin with the definition of paradoxes, and here I quote Sainsbury. A paradox is an apparently unacceptable conclusion derived by apparently acceptable reasoning from apparently acceptable premises. I always focus, as I anticipated, on a specific paradox, which is the liar paradox. Basically, the liar paradox is a proposition that claims to be false. The liar paradox forces us to face a dilemma. The liar's proposition can be either true or false. If it is true, what it declares is true, but since the liar declares to lie, the proposition is false. If the proposition is false, what the proposition declares is false. And since the liar declares to lie, the liar proposition is true. Therefore, if the proposition is true, then it's false, and vice versa. This implies that the liar paradox is true if and only if it is false. The liar paradox is a self-contradictory proposition. It is thus a proposition that is incompatible with itself insofar as it is incompatible with its own claim to be false. The debate on the liar paradox is huge, and there are various strategies to deal with it. I will refer to three main strategies: the standard one, Priest's one, and Hegel's interpretation of the liar paradox in his lecture of the history of philosophy. I will explain why Hegel's interpretation in one regard is dialectist and in another regard it is not. Or to be more precise, I will show that according to Hegel, the dialectist approach to the paradox is correct, even if it is not the whole story about what is going on with the paradox. So I start with some brief consideration about the standard interpretation of the liar paradox, and I use the expression standard interpretation of the paradox to refer to all the treatments of the liar paradox that tries to show that the paradoxical character of the liar proposition is only an apparent one. This can be done mainly in two ways. The first one, by showing the impossibility to define the notion of truth for a language within that language, and the second one, through a criticism of the principle of bivalence. The first move against the liar attempts to deactivate the self-contradictory nature of the paradox through the distinction between object language and meta-language. This distinction between linguistic orders basically corresponds to a parametrization strategy, which differentiates the liar's proposition that is claimed to be false and the liar's proposition that claims the falsehood of the latter. This distinction allows to avoid the contradiction implied by the fact that a proposition states its own falsehood, as in the case of the liar's one. The second strategy against the liar attacks the principle of bivalence and ascribes the liar proposition to the class of proposition that cannot be assigned any truth value. The liar proposition is neither true nor false. And I will say something about Priest's interpretation of the liar paradox. Graham Priest is a kind of a defense lawyer of the liar paradox. In his book In Contradiction, he claims, and I quote, "My aim here is to defend the view that the semantic paradoxes are bona fide sound arguments," end of quote. In order to do this, first, Priest shows that the two lines of attack of the paradox are destined to fail, since they endorse what turns out to be a mission which is impossible to be accomplished. And second, he gives an account of the way the contradiction implied by the paradox has to be conceived. In respect to the first move, I will just mention some points of Priest's defense of the paradox. Concerning the first strategy, to get rid of the paradox, Priest remembers that the Tarskian representation of language according to the hierarchical image of different linguistic order is not a good account of the way in which natural language works. This was recognized by Tarski himself, who believed our ordinary language to be semantically closed, so that the image of the hierarchy of languages could only apply to artificial languages. To give only one example, just think, as Priest notes, of the sentence, "All the sentences of my talk are true." It is a sentence that attributes a truth value to itself and does not distribute the truth value within a supposed hierarchy of languages. At the same time, it is clear, correct sentence, and considering that there must be at least one false sentence in my talk, it has a determinable and determined truth value. Moreover, and even worse, the strategy using the notion of linguistic order gives rise to reinforced form of the paradox, which Priest calls revenge liar. The revenge of the liar is built on the basis of the notion of the theory used to get rid of it. And it is possible to reformulate a revenge liar paradox that uses the notion of linguistic order, which is the proposition that claims to be false within its own order. If this proposition is false within its order, then it is true. And if it is true within its order, then it is false. I will also mention a couple of points of Priest's defense of the liar against the second kind of attack, which is the gappers, claiming that the liar is not to be assigned any truth value. Priest's line of reasoning is simple. The proposition P, this proposition P is true, seems like a perfect candidate to join the class of proposition that cannot be ascribed any truth value. It is an underdetermined proposition. Basically, we do not have any good reason to assign this proposition to the class of true proposition rather than to the class of false ones. Instead, in the case of the proposition P, this proposition P is false, we have the opposite situation. This proposition seems to be overdetermined. That is to say, we have good reason to ascribe it both to the class of true propositions and to the class of false ones, because if it is true, then it is false, and vice versa. What we don't have any good reason for is the ascription of the liar or opposition to the class of propositions that have no truth value. The only justification we have for this move is the need to escape the paradox and the consequent violation of the principle of non-contradiction. But that's not a good justification, since it is not independent from what I wanted to show in the first place, namely that the liar paradox is not paradoxical at all. Moreover, as well as in the case of the first attack, it is possible to formulate a revenge liar on the basis of the notion of gap. For example, consider the proposition that claims to be untrue. If this proposition is true, then what it claims is untrue. If it is untrue, that is, if it is false or neither true nor false, then what it claims is true. Hence, Priest not only shows that the solution to the liar paradox do not work, but also shows that these solutions generate further paradoxes and that, therefore, it is the very nature of our language that implies the contradictions that we meet in paradoxes such as the liars. Therefore, since it doesn't seem to be possible to get rid of the liar paradox, the most reasonable thing to do is to accept it as a sound argument and to learn to deal with the self-contradictory structure of the liar, which is what Priest actually does. In the first chapter of his book, In Contradiction, Priest analyzes the liar proposition as an example of true contradiction. What is particularly interesting for Priest is that the contradiction of the liar fits perfectly in his definition of true contradictions, which are propositions that are both true and false. Priest calls true contradiction dialectias precisely because they are propositions that face both truth and falsehood. And then I go on with Hegel's interpretation of the liar paradox. Hegel analyzes the liar paradox in his lecture on the history of philosophy, and more specifically in the chapter dedicated to the Megarian school. In this part of the lectures, Hegel shows a particular interest for Eubulides, who was the inventor of many logical paradoxes, including the liar paradox. I quote, when Helen was called the liar, pseudomenos, in it the question is put, if a man acknowledges that he lies, does he lie or speak the truth? A simple answer is demanded, for the simple whereby the other is excluded is held to be the truth. If it is said that he tells the truth, this contradicts the content of his utterance, for he confesses that he lies. But if it is asserted that he lies, may be objected that his confession is the truth. He does both lies and does not lie. End of quote. As I anticipated, my thesis is that the Hegelian interpretation of the liar paradox in a certain respect is dialectist, and in another respect, Hegel criticizes and overcomes the dialectist account of the liar paradox. I begin with the first point, which is simpler. From what point of view Hegel can be defined as dialectist? Here I will mention just a few points, but I hope that they are sufficient in order to clarify what I have in mind. First of all, Hegel, just like Priest, presents a diagnosis of the paradox and of its possible solutions. This analysis is aimed at showing their ineffectiveness and the inevitability of the contradiction entailed by the paradox. Curiously, the solutions whose insufficiency are denounced by Hegel are the same ones that are criticized by Priest. The first one uses parametrization, whereas the second one implicitly invokes the notion of gaps. Hegel certainly could not have any familiarity with the Starskian distinction between object language and meta-language. Nevertheless, he certainly was aware of the attempt to solve the liar paradox through parametrization, which was a strategy that he already encountered in Aristotle. In the sophistical refutation, Aristotle tries to solve the liar paradox by invoking the necessity of a second sentence asserted by the liar, which is supposed to be a sentence that verifies or falsifies the liar's claim to lie. In this way, Aristotle points out that the liar sentence cannot be applied to itself and that it must necessarily refer to another sentence. According to some interpreters, with this analysis, Aristotle would anticipate a distinction between different linguistic orders. Maybe that's too much. Anyway, there is no doubt that Aristotle's approach to the liar paradox is based on parametrization. According to Hegel, who surely has in mind precisely the sophistical refutations, the parametrization approach to the liar paradox is not a good answer to the question asking whether the liar paradox is true or false. I quote, thus, the answer should not, as happened in Aristotle, have regard to certain special consideration. And after all, this is really the demand of the understanding. End of quote. The demand of the understanding is to separate conflicting moments in order to avoid the need to account for their contradictory unity. This kind of strategy, according to Hegel, does not work. It provides only a one-sided truth, which is not properly true at all. And it forces the understanding to face again precisely the contradiction that was supposed to be avoided. In this way, the understanding demands falls prey of a revenge contradiction, which is as bad as the one implied by the revenge liar, since it makes explicit the ineffectiveness of the parametrization strategy and the unavoidability of contradiction. For example, when the understanding separates the finite from the infinite in order to avoid their contradictory unification, it falls victim of the absolute contradiction of the bad infinite. I quote, the infinite is to be called the bad infinite, the infinite of the understanding, for which it counts as the highest, the absolute truth. The understanding believes that it has attained satisfaction in the reconciliation of truth, while it is in fact entangled in unreconciled, unresolved absolute contradictions. End of quote. The same happens with the second attack of the liar based on the criticism of the principle of bivalence and on the ascription of the liar proposition to the class of proposition with no truth value. It is precisely the principle of bivalence that Hegel seems to refer to when he speaks of the principle of the simplicity of truth. I quote in Hippolytus' proposition, the main point was that because the truth is simple, a simple answer is required. End of quote. At the same time, however, when Hegel refers to the principle of the simplicity of truth, there seems to be a bit of confusion between two principles that in reality are distinct, that is the principle of bivalence and the principle of the excluded middle, I quote. The simplicity of the truth is thus grasped as a principle. With us, this appears in the form of making such statement as that one of opposite is true, the other false. That a statement is either true or not true, that an object cannot have two opposite predicates. That is the first principle of the understanding, the principium exclusi tertii, which is of great importance in all the science, end of quote. So these two principles are intrinsically related, but they are not equivalent. Simply said, the principle of bivalence states that there are only two truth values, truth and falsehood, and that every proposition is assigned one and only one truth value. That is, every proposition is true or false, or the or must be understood in an exclusive sense. The principle of the excluded middle states that, given a proposition, that proposition is true or its negation is true. Also in this case, the disjunction must be understood in an exclusive sense. The debate on the relationship between the principle of bivalence and the principle of the excluded middle is broad and very complex. It is difficult to determine how much Hegel was aware of the difference between the two principles. Nevertheless, if we look at Hippolytus' formulation of the paradox, which is the one Hegel is referring to, he asks which one of the two opposite predicates, truth or not truth, where the not truth is of a proposition is classically considered as equivalent to the falsehood of the same proposition, had to be ascribed to the liar proposition. Hegel refers to the principle of the excluded middle, but the opposite predicates in question are the two truth values of the principle of bivalence. Simply said, Hegel is wondering whether what the liar is saying is true or false. It is thus clear enough that Hegel has intuited at least that at the basis of the paradox there is the principle of bivalence, so that, I quote, the mistake is to desire an answer of yes or no, end of quote. The principle of bivalence, for which a proposition is true or false, implies first, that a proposition cannot be neither true nor false, and second, that a proposition cannot be both true and false. Hence, Hegel thinks that the possibility to question the principle of bivalence in order to solve the paradox, and that these strategies can take two ways, that is, by questioning the two sides of the principle. The first one, that a proposition should have at least one truth value, and the second, that a proposition cannot have more than one truth value. The first is the solution of to the paradox of those who admit gaps in the truth value. The second is the approach of those who admit the possibility of gluts, that is, the possibility of propositions that are both true and false. Hegel considers the gapper strategy when he claims that, and I quote, the mistake is to desire an answer of yes and no, for since no one ventures on either perplexity ensues, because it is a fool's part not to know what to reply. And I think it is then acknowledges that the gapper's answer is a fool's answer of those pretending to answer the question of the liar paradox with no answer at all. Just as Priest, Hegel rejects the attack of the liar that refuses to assign the liar preposition any truth value. However, the interesting part of the story is that Hegel is aware that no one ventures on the glutter's way. That is the answer to the question, is the liar lying, affirming yes, both yes and no. This answer is not included as a real option in the debate. Nevertheless, this is exactly the answer that, according to Hegel, most makes sense, and this is the only way to account for the liar paradox. When Hegel claims that, I quote, the megaric does kept to the principle of our logic of the understanding in demanding the form of identity for the truth, end of quote, he is not referring to the content of truth values, but to their form. According to the logic underlying our ordinary thought and language, every proposition must have a truth value that has a simple form of identity, and therefore it cannot be composed. For example, the truth value of a proposition cannot be both truth and falsehood. Every proposition must have one and only one truth value, and this form must be identical to itself. That is, the truth value cannot change, as it seems to occur in the case of the liar paradox, which, if it is true, it is false, and vice versa. The megarics, and with them Eubolides, do nothing but analyze the logic of our ordinary thought and language and explore them to the limits of their expressive power. They show that ordinary thought and language hide places where they end up contradicting the same principles on which they were built, such as the principle of the simplicity of the truth. That is, for us, the principle of bivalence. I quote, now, in the cases they put, they did not keep to the universal, but sought example in the ordinary conception by means of which they perplexed people, and these they formed into a kind of system, end of quote. So following the megaric's intuition, Hegel says that the stubborn attachment to the bivalence principle entails the risk for ordinary thought and language to implode in themselves. To keep moving within the limits traced by the principle and wanting to avoid the paradox of the liar is a kind of mission impossible, just as it happens to those who remain trapped in the attempt to square in the circle. In both cases, and as Hegel himself points out, we are looking for a simple answer to a problem that by definition presupposes an answer that undermines the simplicity of our conceptual scheme and makes explicit the need to overcome them. The contradiction, both in the squaring of the circle and in the liar paradox, is not the symptom of an incorrect form of understanding the representation on one side and the language on the other. Quite the contrary, the contradiction depends on the kind of content that we must account for. Trying to remove the contradiction of the liar, therefore, is not a wise and effective way to solve the problem, but only a way to avoid it. An adequate approach to the liar involves the attempt to understand the structure and the value of the contradiction that it entails. And this is what Hegel suggests when he mentioned an example close to the liar paradox. I quote, I will give another similar example along with the answer. Menedemus was asked whether he had ceased to beat his father. This was an attempt to place him in a difficulty, since to answer either yes or no would be equally risky. For if he said yes, then he once beat him, and if no, then he still beats him. Menedemus hence replied that he neither ceased to beat him nor had beaten him. And with this, his opponent were not satisfied. Through this answer, which is two-sided, the one alternative as well as the other being set aside, the question is in fact answered. And this is also so in the former question as to whether the man spoke truly who said he lied. When the reply is made, he speaks the truth and lies at the same time. And the truth is this contradiction. End of quote. Hegel seems to be once again a perfect dialectist. Let's see why. First of all, Hegel relates the analysis of the liar proposition to the situation of Menedemus, who tries to escape the trap of those asking him whether he stopped beating his father, neither in an affirmative way nor in a negative way. Evidently, the situation of Menedemus and of the liar are partly different. Nevertheless, what is the basis of the problem in both situations is all one and the same principle, that is the principle of bivalence. This is Hegel's critical target as well as Priest's. Secondly, the Hegelian attack of the principle of bivalence is not realized following the Gapper's ways, but that of the Glutters. Hegel, as well as Priest, interprets the liar proposition as a true contradiction, namely a proposition that is both true and false. Thirdly, Hegel describes the truth value of the paradoxical proposition exactly like a dialetheia. That is to say, the proposition of the liar as a two-sided truth value, one looking at truth and the other looking at falsehood. The liar, at the same time and in the same respect, is true and false, and therefore the liar both lies and does not lie. I quote, "He does both lie and does not lie, but a simple answer cannot be given to the question raised." For here we have a union of the opposite, of the two opposites, lying and truth, and their immediate contradiction. End of quote. The paradox generates the immediate contradiction of the opposites. If the liar proposition is true, then it is false, and if the liar proposition is false, then it is true. The only answer for the question asking whether the liar is telling the truth or falsehood is a contradictory one. The liar lies and does not lie, and this contradiction corresponds to what Hegel calls the Wahrheit. Or again, as Hegel points out, the contradiction we meet in the liar paradox is not an illusion because it is an actual existing contradiction. I quote, "This sophism does not only appear to be contradictory, but are so in truth. Ist wirklicher Widerspruch vorhanden." Hegel, therefore, like Priest, affirms that the contradiction of the liar is a true contradiction, and this would prove the dialectist thesis that some contradictions are true. Indeed, there are some Hegelian scholars, such as Elena Ficara, Greg Moss, and myself, who attribute some kind of dialectism to Hegel's conception of logic. On this thesis, given the Hegelian interpretation of the liar paradox insofar, I do not think there are many doubts. At the same time, I think it's really important to situate this thesis within a specific sphere of thought and discourse. That is, it is important to understand that the dialectist thesis does not say everything there is to say about the Hegelian interpretation of the paradox, and more generally, about Hegel's theory of contradiction. In this sense, playing a little with the Hegelian notion of Richtigkeit and Wahrheit, I believe that one could say that the dialectist approach to the paradox for Hegel is richtig, but not wahr. That is to say, it is correct, but not true. This is quite clear if we disambiguate the way in which Hegel uses precisely the notion of Wahrheit and Falschheit in the interpretation of the liar paradox. When Hegel writes that, I quote, "In the liar paradox we have the union of two opposites, lie and truth," end of quote, and thus the unity of truth and falsehood, he used the predicates of truth and falsehood in the same sense in which they are used from his point of view within ordinary speech and thought. Therefore, to be precise, he should not use the notions of wahr and falsch, but the notions of richtig and unrichtig. In effect, the notion of truth as Wahrheit, according to Hegel, is to be understood in terms of completeness. In the Phenomenology, Hegel writes that the truth is the whole. And this is not the kind of truth that Hegel has in mind when he says, with respect to the paradox, that the truth is this contradiction. Instead, I think the kind of truth he's thinking of in this sentence is equivalent to his notion of Richtigkeit, which has to do with the traditional idea of truth as correspondence, namely the notion of truth that Hegel encountered in the history of Western thought. And therefore, rather than say that the liar paradox is true and false in an Hegelian perspective, it should be said that it is correct and incorrect because it corresponds and does not correspond at the same time and in the same respect to what the liar is actually doing when he says he is lying. Strictly speaking, we should note that for the liar's proposition, it is impossible to be a bearer of truth in the sense of Wahrheit. Not because of its paradoxical character, but because for Hegel, no simple proposition can express speculative truth. In the case of the liar paradox, we are still dealing with a simple proposition and there is no logical space to express any kind of speculative truth. We are still working in the context of ordinary thought and language, or of what Hegel calls representation. Or to be more precise and in a dialectic perspective, The contradiction of the liar is still a contradiction of common thought and discourse, which is at the same time a contradiction that makes explicit the limits of common thought and discourse, of the notion of truth on which they are based, and the need to go beyond the logical space that these limits at this notion of truth determine. The same line of reasoning is valid for the opposite propositions. He, the liar, does both lies and does not lies. Both are said to be true. To be more precise, they should be said to be both correct, richtig, because each one expresses part of the paradoxical situation of those who claim to be lying. Therefore, each proposition individually considered is one-sided, that is to say, it expresses a necessary but not yet sufficient condition to adequately express what is happening to those who claim to lie. It is precisely for this reason that each of the opposite proposition is certainly correct, but it is at the same time incorrect, unrichtig. Each one is one-sided and is also contradicted by the opposite proposition. One should say, I think, that the conjunction of the two propositions, the liar both lies and does not lie, is trapped in the same uncomfortable situation of those who intend to express, through the conjunction of opposite propositions, the truth of infinity and the necessary relation to the finite. I quote from the Science of Logic. The claim is made that the finite and the infinite are one unity. This is a false claim that needs correction by its opposite. The two are absolutely different and opposed. This claim is in turn to be corrected to the fact that the two are inseparable. That in the one determination, there lies the other by virtue of the claim to unity, and so forth to infinity. The resolution of this contradiction is not the acknowledgement of the equal correctness and of the equal incorrectness of both claims. This would only be another shape of the still abiding contradiction. End of quote. So the proposition, the finite and the infinite are one unity, and the infinite and the finite are absolutely different and opposed, just like the opposite proposition resulting from the liar paradox, according to which he lies and does not lie, are both correct and incorrect. That is, as Priest would say, they are both true and false. In this sense, Hegel would be a perfect dialectist, not only in relation to cases of ordinary language, but also within the sphere of speculative thought. At the same time, with respect to the truth of infinity, Hegel also tells us that, and I want to underline this point, which seems to me particularly important, I quote, the resolution of this contradiction is not the acknowledgement of the equal correctness and of the equal incorrectness of both claims. This would only be another shape of the still abiding contradiction. In fact, even in the case of the liar, when Hegel states that the liar, I quote, speaks the truth and lies at the same time, and the truth is this contradiction, end of quote, he once again uses, I think, the word Wahrheit in a non-technical sense. He means, I think, that the simple conjunction of the opposite proposition according to which the liar lies and does not lie is not true in the sense of being wahr, but once again it is richtig, namely correct. And the simple conjunction of the contradictory proposition is correct and not yet true, because as a simple conjunction it is still one-sided, partial true, since it is not able to express the relation of unity and at the same time of absolute difference of opposite determinations. This relation remains hidden, and so it is underdetermined behind the simple conjunction. Starting from the truth of the simple conjunction of the two contradictory proposition, it is possible, according to the rule of simplification, to deduce the truth of each single proposition. Differently put, by using Hegel's language, starting from the correctness of the simple conjunction of two contradictory propositions, it is possible to deduce that each one of the two propositions is perfectly correct. There are interpreters, including myself in the book I published in 2015, who have rejected the validity of the rule of simplification for Hegel's logic. However, I think I was wrong, since this is precisely what Hegel is referring to when he mentions, I quote, the acknowledgement of the equal correctness and of the equal incorrectness of both claims. This is perfectly equivalent to the dialectics claim according to which, in the philosophical discourse, where truth is understood as a predicate assigned to a proposition, true contradiction is a conjunction of proposition of the form P and not P, and both propositions are both true and false. This is impossible. What is impossible to deduce is not the Richtigkeit, but the Wahrheit of the two opposite propositions. The reason for this is not the impossibility of applying the simplification rule to the conjunction of contradictory proposition, but the fact that the simple conjunction of the opposite proposition is not really wahr, but only richtig. The simple conjunction of opposite propositions here is, in fact, the only answer that we can offer to those who ask whether the liar's proposition is true or false. In other words, it is the best answer we have for those assuming that the liar proposition is a simple proposition, namely a proposition whose truth, according to the standard criteria, depends on a relationship of correspondence to a simple state of affairs. The problem, and Hegel is well aware of this, is that the liar proposition is not simple because it is not simply true, nor it is simply false, and at most only within a certain perspective it can be said to be both true and false. Where truth and falsehood stand side by side as a two-faced truth value. And as we have seen with Priest, the truth and falsehood of the liar paradox, as well as the truth of the conjunction according to which the liar lies and does not lie, and the truth of the individual conjuncts is implied by the relationship of mutual implication at play between the two opposite truth value ascribed to the liar proposition. If the liar proposition is true, then it is false, and vice versa. It is precisely, I think, this relationship of mutual implication that is fundamental to Hegel, and that makes the liar paradox so interesting for him. This mutual implication of opposite embodies within us one single proposition of our ordinary language a structure that preludes that of the unity of opposite determination on the basis of which speculative truth is articulated. We can follow the dialectist and implement a sort of dissection of the liar proposition by resolving the biconditional relation according to which P is true if and only if is false in the simple conjunction P is false and P is true. This is equivalent to P and not P, and implies the truth as well as falsehood of both conjuncts. This is the dialectist account. This move allows to present a correct but one-sided analysis of the paradox. It is certainly a more manageable way of administrating the complexity of the paradox without denying it entirely. At the same time, this move removes from focus the element that is most interesting for Hegel, that is the relationship between the opposite determinations. This relationship, the unification of opposite, remains something unthinkable for representation, for ordinary thought, for finite consciousness. The best that finite consciousness can do, according to Hegel, what Priest does, that is to break the paradoxical relationship of opposite into a truth value that is still one single truth value, in order to keep faith to the requirement of the principle of simplicity. Bivalence is overcome, but a simple proposition is still assumed as truth bearer. At the same time, dialectism splits this truth value into two phases looking in two opposite directions. In this sense, Hegel points out that, I quote, if the consciousness of opposition is present, our ordinary ideas keep the contradictory sides apart. End of quote. The dialectist that invokes a third truth-sided truth value is thus breaking the contrasting relation between truth and falsehood that essentially characterizes the liar proposition into two opposite sides, so much that it is possible to separate the abstract and fixed truth of each of them. In this way, the dialectist is certainly pushing the paradigm of finite thought to its extreme consequences, but it is still trapped in it. What I mean is that, according to Hegel, the dialectist approach to the paradox is the highest point at which the finite thought and language of representation can go. We have reached, with the dialectist solution, the limits of the schemes that support our traditional way of thinking. we are at the point where the logical space in which we normally move risks self-imploding. That is a risk from which we can escape only through a revision of our traditional conceptual schemes. And this is precisely what Hegel aims at. In fact, when he looks at the liar, Hegel recognizes the legitimacy of the dialectist response. This is a correct answer, and indeed it is the best possible answer we have when we assume the validity of the classical working tools of formal logic. In his analysis of the liar paradox, therefore, Hegel endorses the dialectist approach. However, at the same time, I think he recognizes it as a position that traces the limit beyond which ordinary thought is annulled, precisely because this approach is unable to understand the unity of opposite determination in their equally essential contrast. The overcoming of this limit, of course, requires the transition to another type of discourse, that is, to another type of thought. I quote, "But the ordinary consciousness is then at the end, for only where there is a contradiction is there a solution, self-abrogation. Ordinary consciousness has not the conception that only the unity of opposites is the truth." End of quote. And it is interesting to note that Hegel uses the term sich aufheben to identify the limit where the contradiction immanent in our ordinary language arises, as it occurs in the case of the liar paradox. On the one hand, at this point, we have the Auflösung of the ordinary consciousness, namely its dissolution. On the other hand, the point of the dissolution of our traditional conceptual schemes has the characteristics of sich aufheben, and therefore of a negation that does not fail to lead ordinary consciousness to redetermine this conceptual scheme in a new paradigm of thought. This is the thought that in Hegelian terms we can define as speculative thinking, namely that thought that has, I quote, the conception that only the unity of opposites is the truth. In order to underline the difference between Hegel and the dialectist approach to the liar paradox, and more in general to the theory of contradiction, I would like to end my talk with a Yoruba story. The story is about the shoe, that is a sacred entity in the Yoruba religion. And this is an interesting story about the shoe who takes two friends to fight to death. The story goes like this. Two friendly peasants started working in their fields very early, but both stopped praising a shoe who has always given them rain and good harvests. A shoe was furious, wearing a pointed cap, on one side white and on the other red. A shoe walked on the border of the fields, with one on his right and the other on his left. He passed between the two friends and greeted them emphatically. The peasants looked at each other. Who was the stranger? Who is the stranger in a white cap? Asked one. Who is the stranger in the red cap? Asked the other. The cap was white. White, said one. No, the cap was red, said the other. White, red, white, red. They began to argue about the color of the cap. White, red, white, red. They ended up fighting with whole blows, killing each other. A shoe sang and danced. A shoe was avenged. So in my talk, what I wanted to show is that Hegel, like the dialectist, knows that the stranger's cap is both red and white. But he knows that this is not the whole story about the strangers. He also knows that the stranger is not a stranger at all. He knows what the stranger is doing, why he is doing that, and therefore why the two peasants end up killing each other. He understands their limits and what they are destined to. This is why it is necessary to praise a shoe. He is the messenger between the human beings and deities, and he can open up for us a broader way to understand how things are. In the same way, it is necessary to cast out on the standard conceptual schemes sedimented in our thought and language. Only by doing that, we will make explicit the limits and the necessity to overcome them in a wider conception of rationality. Thank you for your attention. Gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Michela, por esta conferencia tan interesante. Y ahora abrimos el espacio para las preguntas, o comentarios que pueda haber. Tarda ahora siempre un poco en aparecer las preguntas porque primero son hechas creo que en Facebook y después luego las vemos aquí en Zoom. Ya que estoy mientras esperamos, ¿se entiende, Michela? Or should I say it in English? Or we are
waiting for question, right?
Exactly. Aspettiamo.
Interrupt.
Yes, because first I think they are formulated in Facebook, and then they have to copy and send us the questions here in this Zoom meeting. So that's why it takes a little bit of time. And maybe I can ask you just not probably a question. It's just a commentary. There are many different ways of dealing with the liar paradox, and you know, do you see other possible relations between, for example, Hegel and other solutions, and other ways of other approaches to the liar paradox, like Kripke or Tarski, or just you would relate Hegel just with the Graham Priest and that dialectics, or do you know? Maybe this is just.
Thank you for the question. The answer is that I don't know. For now, I go back to this problem of the liar paradox because I was reading some papers on the topic, and I found that I was wrong in the book because I also tried. I tried to relate Hegel's interpretation with the Priest one, as I tried to show. I think it's partly, this is partly true. It partly works. But at the same time, it would be interesting probably to see what's the relation between Hegel and Tarski critics of the paradox. This implies to question or to investigate the relation between object language and meta language. I mean, not only in this analysis of the paradox, but also, for example, in the logic. And this is kind of really interesting because I think that in the logic we find this in Hegel's dialectic and in dialectic of the logic, we find some structure that are paradoxical in the same sense of the liar paradox one. Precisely because we don't have this distinction between object language and meta language, I think. Because the logic seems to be a process of self-explicitation of a thought thinking itself. And so I wonder, how can I distinguish different linguistic orders within the dialectical process through which the logic is developed? I think the distinction is not applicable to the logic. And also in the interpretation of the paradox, Hegel mentions the sophistical refutation by Aristotle. I started to investigate, to do some research about Aristotle's solution of the paradox. And it's true that he couldn't really have, as Hegel, familiarity with the Tarskian distinction. But he really seems to distinguish between two sentences. One claiming to lie, and another sentence which verifies or falsifies the first one. And Hegel clearly says that this strategy, again, to solve the paradox, does not is not effective. It cannot have any success. And he equates this strategy with something with the strategy that is always performed by the understanding in the whole logic. which is the distinction of respects in order to avoid the contradiction, especially in the first abstract moment of the understanding. So there are a lot of things that still needs to be clarified, and I think that the relation, to investigate the relation between Hegel and the Tarskian strategy can be interesting in order to underline the specificity of Hegel's philosophical discourse. The other strategy, the Gapper strategy, is also interesting. And I still don't have an answer, but Hegel seems to think something very close to Priest, because it seems difficult for me to understand in which sense he can admit proposition with no truth value, especially in the logic. For Priest, propositions that are untruth are propositions that are not verified by any state of affairs, and so they are false. And I think that in Hegel's logic, there's something similar. I mean, there's no gap in Hegel's logical space. But these are the three main strategies, as far as I know. The Gapper's one, the Tarskian one, and the dialectist one. I think that it's clear that Hegel goes in the dialectist way with respect to the paradox, but we really always need to remember that he's talking about the Megarian school is still in the in the sphere of representation, natural language, and so it's not entered yet in the domain of speculative truth. I don't know if I answered your question.
Okay. No, thank you very much. We do have some questions now, and well, I begin. We have from Josimar Castilla, and well, okay, I read it in Spanish, and if you don't understand something, you ask me and try to translate it into English. Dice, ¿podría profundizar en la idea de contradicción como autonegación? Continúo, dicen, ¿por qué es más adecuada que la idea de Brandon de la contradicción como incompatibilidad material? ¿Esta diferencia tiene consecuencias? Es una pregunta, ¿no? Para la manera en que Hegel presenta, bueno, aquí dice, la libertad como autodeterminación.
I think I will answer the first part, the last couple of lines. I think we need to. we can talk next year. I do some research. Okay. But the first part is really interesting. This question, and thank you, Josimar. I wrote a paper on the topic some years ago, and I was just comparing Priest and Brandon's interpretation of Hegel, because Priest is a logics and a philosopher of logics, but he also wrote some papers about Hegel's dialectic. Okay. And it makes a big difference, because I actually think that Brandon, by interpreting determinate negation through the notion of material incompatibility, goes precisely in a way that is precisely the opposite of Priest's one. Actually, there's a paper in Tales of the Mighty that where Brandon claims that far from denying the law of non-contradiction, Hegel radicalizes the value of the law of non-contradiction. So he seems to present a kind of coherentist reading of the dialectic. But I think that the crucial character of a determinate negation that Brandon cannot account for is precisely the self-referential structure of determinate negation, which is kind of the best example for me is the simplest example for me is the finite. Because if I assume a brand of negation, notion of material incompatibility in order to read determinate negation, I should say that finite and infinite are materially incompatible. So they remain fixed, one separate from the other. Okay, but this is just the notion of finite and of infinitude that Hegel criticizes. In order to think finite and infinity in the way that presented by Hegel and the science of logic, we need to go beyond, I think, Brandon's proposal and to think the self-referentiality of negation. And this means to think a finite or the finite such that the finite is finite only if it negates itself. The finite is finite only so far as it ends, only insofar as it passes over into its other. And this is what Hegel calls the self-negation of the finite. Now, I don't see how we can account for this dialectic through Brandon's notion of material incompatibility. And of course, this this point is relevant, is so much important for the thing that you mentioned, the point that Josimar mentioned in the last crucial question. Esta diferencia tiene consecuencias para la manera en que Hegel presenta la libertad como autodeterminación. I think that the answer is yes. If you want to give an account of Hegel's notion of freedom, you need to understand how determinate negation works in the logic and especially in the doctrine of the concept. Okay, I think that's my answer. I hope.
There's one question from Xavier Aranda. He formulated the question directly in English, but I read it in case you don't see that, also so that the public hears that. Do you think there's a way to relate to contemporary logic, the Hegelian logic between universals, particulars, and singulars? And in your presentation, I think it's rather clear how the contributions of Hegelian thought would impact some problems like justification, and again, to use certain terms like syllogism, make difficult to relate the Hegelian logic to contemporary epistemology.
Okay. I think about the concerning the part on the dialectic of the universal, particular, and singular. I don't think if there is any particular relation between dialectic and dialectism, but I can suggest to read a book of a colleague and friend, Greg Moss. I think he mentions the book says much important things on this topic. I still need to read this book, and I just read the beginning, and I need to have there will be a presentation of the book in Brazil. So on a dialectic, dialectism, this dialectic, I can make this reference. In the contemporary metaphysics and not logic, I think there is an important link between Hegel's logic and process metaphysics, which is something that I'm studying too, that I'm researching, but this exceeds the question of the topic of the formal logic. So the last part, the second part of the question deals with the problem of justification and contemporary epistemology. this question deals with another part of my research, which is the research about McDowell's thesis of the unboundedness of the conceptual. But this really exceeds the topic of the talk, so I don't know if you want me to talk about this. If I can just make a brief consideration what I thought about this actualization of Hegel thought, I think that it is really interesting but this kind of actualization of Hegel's thought, and especially of Hegel's logic, because when McDowell mentioned the unboundedness of the concept, I think he's referring to the thesis of objective thought. Okay, this kind of actualization runs the risk to lose an important part of Hegel's project, logical project, which is its ontological relevance, which is something that McDowell really does not want to endorse because of his therapeutic approach. So it's an interesting and important way to actualize Hegel thought, but I still think that we need to go back to Hegelian text in order not to lose some other important stuff. Okay.
Thank you very much. We have a last question from Profesor Miguel Giusti. La leo en español, si no se entiende algo me preguntas. Dice, el profesor Giusti pregunta, dice, no me queda clara la diferencia entre corrección, Richtigkeit, y verdad, Wahrheit. No son lo mismo en el marco de una definición de la verdad. ¿Qué tan diferente es una corrección de una verdad?
I don't know. He's asking the difference between Richtigkeit and Wahrheit.
Yeah.
They are not the same. En el marco, I don't understand el marco.
Yeah. Sí, digamos, supongo que es en relación a la definición de la verdad, no son exactamente, no serían lo mismo Richtigkeit que Wahrheit en cuanto a su definición. ¿Qué tan diferente? Básicamente creo que la pregunta es esa, ¿cuál es la diferencia?
Okay. I really hope no one asked this question because it's the most difficult one. Of course, they are not the same for Hegel. I did not say anything in my talk about what is Wahrheit. I said something about what is Richtigkeit. I think that mainly Hegel endorses the standard conception of truth that he encountered in the Western philosophical tradition. In various points of the logic, he mentioned the correspondence theory of truth as a limited account of truth, of course. It is really problematic to, much more problematic to explain what Wahrheit is. And I can, I want to mention the book of our friends and colleague, Giovanni Miolli, Il pensiero della cosa, which is a book on the notion of Hegel's notion of truth. I like to say that Hegel defines Wahrheit in terms of completeness. So we can, when I said that Richtigkeit and Wahrheit are different, of course this is true, but at the same time, I think that Richtigkeit is a part of Wahrheit insofar as it is a partial truth. Okay, I think this was my answer. I don't know if Miguel wants to ask something more about this difficult topic, but that's really the most interesting point for me, because my doubt, because I'm using this opportunity to see if what I have in mind is Wahr. My doubt is about Hegel's use of Wahrheit and Wahrheit in his interpretation of the life paradox. Okay, So he uses the notion of variety in that context, but I think he's not using this notion in a technical sense. This was my intuition. Okay?
Thank you very much. Tenemos una... Miguel dice que, no, perfect, it was a very satisfying answer. Entonces, tenemos una pregunta de Carlos Silva, que dice, ¿el uso de esta paradoja también puede ser encontrado en las obras de Kant o alguna aproximación?
I don't know. That's a simple answer for me. I don't know. I must, that's something that I need to research. If someone has some reference, please get in contact. But I need to do more research on this because it's really interesting, this question, because it leads me back to Hegel and Christ, you know. Because Priest assumes the contradiction of the liar paradox as the first example of true contradiction in his book. He refers to Hegel as the main antecedent of the main predecessor of this thesis. And he explicitly, he analyzes the relation between Kant and Hegel's notion of contradiction in the beginning of his book, right before talking about the liar paradox. So, looking at what Kant says about the paradox, maybe would be really, really interesting. But honestly, I don't know in which place of his text Kant speaks about this. I need to look for it. So, thank you for the suggestion.
Bueno, ya entonces se ha hecho poco tarde, de hecho no hay más preguntas, así que, bueno, en nombre de Filored y de los colegas del Centro de Estudios Filosóficos de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, te damos las gracias, Michela, por esta conferencia tan interesante y también agradecemos a la audiencia por el interés y la participación. Y los invitamos a que participen de la próxima edición del ciclo de conferencias de la actualidad del pensamiento hegeliano, pensamiento de Hegel, que va a tener lugar el próximo lunes 26 de abril, también como siempre a las 19 horas, a las 7 de la tarde, hora peruana. Y en la próxima edición vamos a tener la participación del profesor Sergio Pérez Cortés de la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, ¿no?, de la Ciudad de México, que se va a ocupar de hablarnos de la actualidad de la concepción hegeliana de la filosofía del Estado. Bueno, entonces esperamos verlos. Y bueno, nuevamente muchas gracias, Michela. Y, bueno,
gracias.
Y buenas noches a todos. Saludos.